All right, we're back with another reporting category. We're looking today at reporting category 4, regional interactions. This is going to be the first video of two, so just make sure you're looking out for that second video as soon as this one ends. The first one we're going to be looking at is Asia, Africa, and the Americas, which is standard 11, 12, and 13. These three categories go well together because they are in different regions of the world apart from Europe. Asia is the very first one that we're going to cover. The first part of Asia is looking at major trade routes throughout Asia and the Mediterranean. During the medieval period, there are several major trading routes that develop in the Eastern Hemisphere, which is essentially Europe, Africa, and Asia. There's three main trade routes that you kind of need to know about, which is the Silk Road, which runs from Asia to the Mediterranean Sea, the maritime routes that kind of run across the ocean from India through the Middle East area and down into South Africa, the Trans-Saharan trade route that runs across North Africa into Timbuktu from Egypt area. Over these trade routes, there's three main things that kind of travel: goods, technology, and ideas. Goods are things that are like products. So some of the products that travel across the Trans-Saharan trade route were gold and salt from West Africa, that was from Timbuktu area, spices from around the Indian Ocean, textiles from India and China, porcelain from China and Persia, and then amber from the Baltic region. All are traveling along the trade routes. Technology that would have traveled along these trade routes was paper from China, which also leads to the development of the printing press, new crops from India, water wheels and windmills. And then the really main thing that's traveling here is the navigation tools that is going to aid in exploration coming into the 1500s. You've got the compass from China, the lateen sail, and the astrolabe, which helps explorers to travel over long distances. Lastly, ideas are things like religion, any sorts of technological advancements that aren't really necessarily like a actual tangible object. For example, from China to Japan, you see the spread of Buddhism. From India into the rest of Southeast Asia, you see the spread of Buddhism, and then Islam into West Africa along that Trans-Saharan trade route. Printing and paper money also come from China, which has a major impact on Europe, especially with the development of the printing press into the Renaissance era. Japan was a mountainous archipelago that was super, super close to China. Archipelago meaning that it was a chain of 4 islands. The way that you can recognize Japan on a map is that it is literally shaped like a J. J for Japan. Japan was influenced heavily by Chinese culture. They had very similar writing systems with the symbols that they used. The architecture was very similar with the sloping roofs. And they also used Buddhism as their main religion there. Shintoism was an ethnic religion that was unique to Japan, but it mixed with Buddhism very, very nicely. Shintoism is a little bit similar to Taoism in that it emphasizes natural features, forces of nature, and the worship of ancestors. It is a state religion, and Japanese also worship the emperor. The Mongols were nomadic herders. You might have heard of them traveling on horseback with Genghis Khan. They are featured in quite a few films. The Mongol armies end up invading Russia, Southwest Asia, and China, creating a massive empire, converting to local religions after they come in and take them over. One of the other things that the Mongols are known for is the spread of the Black Death. Africa. There's 3 parts of Africa that you need to be well versed in: the West African kingdoms, Axum, and Zimbabwe. There's 3 West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, that kind of appear in the same place, kind of on that little loop out to the side of Africa. They are relative to the Niger River and the Sahara. This is a place in which gold and salt are major products that are being developed in this area, and they're crossing via the Trans-Saharan trade route. It's going to have a major impact on the Renaissance as that gold enters from West Africa into Europe. One of the big cities that developed as a result of the trade that's happening is Timbuktu, and this is also a location there was a lot of learning happening. Because it was such a big trading city, there was a lot of ideas and knowledge being transferred here. And Mansa Musa, which was one of the main emperors of this era, he actually brought in a lot of Muslim scholars to bring a lot of learning to this area under his control. They also had the spread of Islam. You see that spreading across the Trans-Saharan trade route. Again, Mansa Musa also brought that in. On the other side of Africa, you've got Axum and Zimbabwe. Axum was located kind of at the bottom of the Nile River, kind of off on the far right-hand side of Africa. It is one of the first Christian kingdoms and becomes really linked with Rome. Zimbabwe is located on the Zambezi River. Zimbabwe, Zambezi, they go together, ZZ. And they also connect to the Indian Ocean because it was a great trading route. Those maritime routes that were running across the Indian Ocean are going to hit through the great city of Zimbabwe, and it leads to a lot of trade with them. Here you can see the Trans-Saharan trade route running across the Sahara Desert. You can see where Ghana and Mali is. Songhai would also have been in that area as well. The Americas. We're talking about the Aztec, the Mayans, and the Incans. You can always tell where the Aztecs are on the map because A is the first letter in the alphabet, and A is the first, Aztecs are the very first civilization to appear in the central Mexico. Then you have the Mayans, where it comes out on the hump there. You can look at the hump and think, oh, it's a hump in the letter M. And then the Incas are the big old long line that looks a little bit like an eye on the spine of South America. Now, many of these civilizations have things in common. The Mayans, for example, are very similar to the Incas in that they were both kind of in a rainforest area. The Mayans are represented by Chichen Itza, which is the pyramid that you see on the picture on the screen there. It's a group of city-states that were ruled by a king. They had a lot of agriculture. They did a little bit of trading, but agriculture was their big enterprise. Just like all the rest of these civilizations, the Mayans were polytheistic, and they built pyramids. The Aztecs, as you can see in the picture, also built pyramids. They were very similar in that respect. It is located in the arid valley in central Mexico. They're not going to have a lot of opportunity for agriculture because the soil is not going to be quite fertile enough. So they created these man-made water-floating islands called chinampas they used. They also did quite a bit of trade to get the goods and materials that they needed from other parts of the empire. They were ruled by an emperor. And they were also polytheistic and, just like the Mayans, performed rituals on the top of pyramids. The Incas, they were located in the Andes Mountains of South America, very, very mountainous area. And because it was so mountainous, they used high-altitude agriculture that resulted in them creating terraces, such as the ones that you see here in the picture. They would have created these flat areas in which they could plant crops to have large crop yields. They were also polytheistic. The picture that you see over there is Machu Picchu, one of the largest cities. And all of the Incan Empire was connected via a road system that was comparable to the Romans. Go ahead, take a breather, take the practice quiz that's located in the description below, and meet me back here. Now we're going to cover the late Middle Ages, standard 14. This is following the feudal system. We start to see these nation states developing as a result of the smaller kingdoms that had been built during the feudal era. England, France, Russia, and Spain are going to be the main countries that start to develop as a result of feudalism. England is going to be conquered by William the Conqueror, who was able to unite most of England under his rule. Following him, England becomes even more united under a common law that creates a law system that affects all the people within the kingdom. King John signs the Magna Carta, which limits the king's power and gives power back to the nobles, and that's how we see the evolution of Parliament developing and becoming more of a law system that they have to follow. The 100 Years' War, both for England and France, helps them to create their identity as a country. Because they are fighting in that war, their people are starting to recognize themselves as English or French. In French, you've got Hugh Capet and the Capetian dynasty that establishes the French rule over Paris and then eventually all over France. And just like we said before, the 100 Years' War really helps to define France as a nation as the French people unify behind the Joan of Arc. Spain and Russia also are developing. Ferdinand and Isabella unify the country, and they start to create a common enemy for the people to kind of get behind. During the Spanish Inquisition, they expel most of the Jews and the Moors, aka the Spanish Muslims, out of Spain, and they eventually start to expand their empire by moving into the Americas. In Russia, you've got Ivan the Great, who overthrows the power of the Mongols and centralizes power in Moscow. He's able to expand Russia vastly, and he centralizes power. This centralized power is known as the Tsar, which is the Russian word for king. And just like we talked about in previous videos here, the Orthodox Church is still the main church in Russia, and they got that from the Byzantine Empire. The Crusades was also a pretty important event that happened during the late Middle Ages. It carried out by Christian political and religious leaders to take control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. It was led by the Christians, specifically the Christian monarchs, the Catholic monarchs, and then the Catholic leaders such as the Pope. The very first event that kind of kicks off the Crusades is Pope Urban's speech. He is protecting the Byzantine Empire, their Christian brothers, even though it was Greek Orthodox, not Catholic. And he sends all of the Christians kind of on this crusade, literally, to save the Holy Land from the Muslims. During the First Crusade, the Christian forces are able to capture Jerusalem and set up 4 different Crusader states that are each led by a different monarch. By the Third Crusade, though, most of the Crusades were not very successful, leading to the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin, one of the Muslim leaders, and eventually the sack of Constantinople. This weakens the Pope and the nobles and strengthens the monarchs because they're the ones that are sending people down. They're kind of funding the Crusades as a whole. It stimulates trade between the Mediterranean and the Middle East as the Crusaders are coming back from their crusade. They have a high interest in the Middle Eastern products. It also leaves a legacy of bitterness between Christians and Jews and Muslims because they're fighting each other. Along the way, Christians were taking over the Jewish pogroms and then fighting the Muslims when they got there. It wasn't a very good time for religion. It also leads to the weakening of the Byzantine Empire and allows the Ottomans to come in and take over. We already talked about the Mongols a little bit. They invade China, Russia, and the Muslim states, and they create a large empire that kind of spans all of Eurasia for the most part. And as we talked about before, the Ottoman Turks take over Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire, and they eventually make Constantinople the capital of the Ottoman Empire. In the 14th century, the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, kills off as so much of the population that it has a significant impact on the decline of feudalism. Because there was such a decline in the population, there's not enough people to work, which leads to a scarcity of labor. Since there's such a scarcity of labor, they're no longer able to fulfill their feudal agreements, and so feudalism is on the major decline. You also see a decline of church influence as people are no longer trusting the church because they had believed that this Black Death kind of was an impact of their church attendance and whatnot. It also disrupts trade because Black Death was traveling over the water routes and some of these trade routes. People are going to shut down trade for a while trying to get rid of the Black Death. In the Middle Ages, we also see an increase in education, especially amongst church scholars. The rest of Europe pretty much was uneducated. There was very few people who could read and write. Many of these church scholars were in monasteries translating Greek and Arabic works into Latin, which makes new knowledge, philosophy, medicine, and science available in Europe. And this really ultimately lays the foundation for the Renaissance that is to come. Go ahead and pause here, take the quiz, and then join me back here for video 2.